Good afternoon, and welcome to an extremely topical and extremely timely AMIT webinar. Tonight, Jews throughout the world will begin commemorating Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, which reflects upon the systematic mass murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children throughout Europe. How could the world let this happen? When did we in the United States find out about it? Why did the White House not bomb the railway lines to Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen, Treblinka, Sachsenhausen, and so many other places that makes our collective visions of hell look somewhat innocent? What was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, so admired and so adored by Jews, possibly thinking? When did he find out? What were the obstacles in his mind to actually doing something, doing anything to rescue more Jews from their inevitable hell and possible death? When did our illustrious newspapers, such as the New York Times, find out? How much care and attention did their editors put into covering these stories? Here to answer these questions and more is Dr. Rafael Medoff, perhaps one of the most respected Holocaust historians alive today. Dr. Rafael Medoff is the founding director of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies and the author of more than 20 books about Jewish history and the Holocaust. His latest book is America and the Holocaust, a documentary history published by the Jewish Publication Society and University of Nebraska Press. Rafi, first, when did FDR first find out about the Holocaust? What did he do? And what prevented him from doing more?
Well, when we consider the subject of President Roosevelt's response to the Holocaust and the extent to which his administration was aware of what was happening in Nazi Germany, I like to begin by going back a little bit before the mass murder period and discuss something important about his response to Kristallnacht, the infamous nationwide pogrom in Nazi Germany in November 1938. Before I share a document with our audience, I just want to thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to be on this webinar today, and I appreciate your kind words of introduction. Kristallnacht is regarded by most historians as a turning point in the history of the Holocaust, because it was then that German government policy moved from discrimination and social ostracizing of Jews in Germany to organized violence. But still, it was in the period prior to the mass killing. So in the chronological timeline, Kristallnacht was in late 1938. The mass murder of the Jews, what we call the Holocaust, began in the summer of 1941. So I'll return to that in a moment. But I want to begin by sharing a glimpse of the American news media coverage of the Kristallnacht pogrom, because it's important to realize that during the 1930s and up until 1941, the Germans did not hide what they were doing. Later, of course, they went to great lengths to try to keep their mass murder of the Jews out of the public's eye, because of their mistaken assumption that if the word got out, that the Allies would intervene. But in this pre-World War II and pre-Holocaust period, the Nazi regime was quite open about what it was doing. So when we look here at the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, a day after the Kristallnacht pogrom, we were reminded that this is something that everybody knew about. You see, it's a banner headline in the Inquirer, and as it was in many other major American newspapers. During that nationwide pogrom, the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, nearly 100 Jews were murdered. Hundreds of Jewish stores and shops and synagogues were burned down. Thousands of windows in Jewish stores and homes were shattered, which is how the pogrom came to be known as Kristallnacht, Night of the Glass, Night of the Broken Glass. So we begin our look at how FDR responded to the Holocaust, and especially his relationship with the press, and how that relationship affected US policy with the simple fact that at this point, in 1938, there was no doubt about what was happening. Now, the reason I bring this up about Kristallnacht is because now I want to discuss an interesting exchange that took place at FDR's first regularly scheduled press conference following Kristallnacht. And I want to share with you a page from the actual transcript of FDR's press conference. Incidentally, this is also a little glimpse at how historians of America's response to the Holocaust, how we know what we know. So FDR had many press conferences. He was a very press-friendly president. During the course of his 12 years in office, he had many hundreds of press conferences on an average of about one every approximately 2 weeks. It varied according to world events, but that's pretty often compared to almost any other president. We all know, of course, about FDR's famous fireside chat. So his mastery of the art of communications was one of the important aspects of his presidency. And the press conferences were another way in which FDR got his message out to the public. When we look at, when we look at this excerpt from the press conference after Kristallnacht, what we're going to see right away is that President Roosevelt controlled these press conferences. These were very friendly events. You did not have almost ever instances in which reporters really confronted or challenged the president. Now, of course, even to this day, as we know, at presidential press conferences or press conferences of other administration spokespeople, a lot of the questions are friendly, but not all of them. There are always at least a few reporters who ask challenging questions. In FDR's case, that almost never happened. First of all, because the press in general, and I'm saying press here, not news media, I'm saying press because in those days we're speaking primarily about newspaper coverage, obviously not television and really not radio either. So first of all, most of the Washington press corps was extremely friendly and sympathetic to President Roosevelt and his agenda. So that's one aspect. Secondly, FDR's aides often planted questions with friendly members of the press corps. So really, FDR was only given what we would call softball questions typically. And if a question was leading towards something he didn't want to talk about, he would simply say, "That's all I have to say, move on." And that would be the end of it. So it wasn't as if you had a situation where the press was confronting the president about the Holocaust or asking him questions that would challenge his policies in any way. Rather, the American press in the 1930s and into the 1940s really was almost just another platform for President Roosevelt on the issues that interested him and the issues that he wanted to talk about. And I want to emphasize, he did not want to talk about the persecution of the Jews in Europe. I'll return to the reasons why in a moment. First, let's take a brief look at the press conference, the one that was held in 2 days after the Kristallnacht pogrom and after the headlines that we just saw. And this, by the way, this is an actual transcript. All of the transcripts of FDR's press conferences are available online, helpfully. They're all at the FDR Library and Archives in Hyde Park, New York. And they're a great source of information, but they're a source of information on how Roosevelt handled the press and handled the issues that he cared about. They're not a source of information on the press doing what the press is supposed to be doing, which is challenging those in power and asking real questions. So here we see at the top of the page, now this is on page 4. I point that out because it means the first 3 pages, FDR is talking about other subjects. He did not bring up the question of this massive, unprecedented nationwide pogrom in Germany. But it was because it was headline news, inevitably somebody was going to bring it up. So here you see the question at the top of the page. Mr. President, have you anything to say about the Nazi government's expanded campaign against the Jews as a result of the shooting of the German diplomat in Paris 2 or 3 days ago? That was the pretext that the Nazis used for what was in fact a pre-planned nationwide campaign of violence. So, Mr. President, have you anything to say? And the president's response, no, I think not, Fred. You better handle that through the State Department. And that's it. And that's it. Then they move on to other questions. There's a brief question about British policy, and then move on to completely other things. That's it. The president doesn't want to talk about it. There's no follow-up question. That's it. Now, let me briefly comment on why it was he didn't want to talk about it. Drawing attention to the plight of the Jews in Europe meant increasing the pressure on the administration to do something about it. Now, while it's true that there was a great deal of anti-Semitism in the 1930s, and while it's also true that there was strong opposition both in Congress and the public to, for example, increased immigration of Jewish refugees and others. Nonetheless, there was a minority of Americans, members of Congress, liberal journalists, Jewish organizations, of course, and other refugee advocates who did want the administration to do something. So the more attention the president drew to this issue, the more he talked about the plight of the Jews in Europe, the more he would face questions and pressure to actually do something. What could he have done in response to Kristallnacht? Well, of course, there were many options. He could have suspended diplomatic relations with Germany, for example. He could have limited or reduced US trade with Germany. There was substantial American-German trade during those years because in general, the Roosevelt administration maintained very cordial, sometimes even friendly economic relations with Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Or he could have admitted more Jewish refugees, either to the United States or to an American territory, such as, for example, the Virgin Islands, whose governor and legislative assembly offered to open their doors to more Jewish refugees. So there were options, but these were not options that were discussed at press conferences, and they're not options that the president wanted to call attention to because of the problem of increasing public pressure to actually do any of those things. One more word on Kristallnacht before we move into the 1940s and the period of the mass killing. Because there was so much attention in the news media to the pogrom, and because there were many cries of protest from Jewish groups, not just from Jewish organizations, prominent Christian clergymen, certain segments of the media, publications like the New Republic and The Nation, for example, and other sources, and certain members of Congress, principally Jewish members of Congress, but others as well. Because of those many calls, after a number of days, the president finally agreed to issue a statement in response to Kristallnacht. Notice that in the first days, he didn't even issue a statement. In fact, no world leader, just to be clear, no world leader issued an explicit public condemnation of the Kristallnacht pogrom. So in this sense, Roosevelt was going a little further than the others. But again, we're only speaking about a condemnation. So I want to show you the statement which the president read at his next press conference 4 days later, which he read this aloud to the assembled press, and they reported it. And here we're looking at his actual handwritten copy of the statement he issued. As you see, it's quite short. It is in fact a total of 2 sentences with a third sentence added in handwriting below. I'll return to that in a moment. The statement reads, "The news of the past few days from Germany has shocked public opinion in the United States. Such news from any part of the world would inevitably produce a similar profound reaction among American people. With a view to gaining a firsthand picture of the situation in Germany, I asked the Secretary of State to order our ambassador in Berlin to return for report and consultation." And then the handwriting in the bottom, that's FDR's handwriting. He added, "I myself could scarcely believe that such things could occur in a 20th century civilization." The initials at the bottom are the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, indicating his approval of the statement. So we have here a draft personally annotated by the president. If you look at it carefully, you'll notice several things that are missing from this statement by the president. Let's start with the victims and with the perpetrators. There's no reference to the Jews, to the victims, to the 100 Jews who were murdered, the thousands of Jewish homes and stores that had their windows smashed, the 30,000 German Jews who were hauled off to concentration camps. So reference to the victims. There's also no reference to the perpetrators. There's no condemnation of Hitler, the Nazis. You don't see the words Hitler or Nazis here. The German government is not blamed in the statement for what happened. The entire statement is essentially just an expression of general sympathy with no practical consequence, except, as you see, the U.S. ambassador in Berlin was being asked to return for his report. He was not withdrawn. There was no change in American-German diplomatic relations. He was simply brought back to Washington to report and to consult. This was the extent of the president's public response in terms of a condemnation. When he read it at the press conference, a reporter actually asked, "Do you have anything to add to your statement, sir?" And he said, "No, the statement speaks for itself." He didn't want to go any further. He was throwing a bone to the Jewish groups and the liberal congressmen who were concerned about this. He didn't want to make it into any bigger of an issue than he had to, so to speak. Now let's move on to the early 1940s and the question of what the president and what the news media knew about the Holocaust, that is the organized mass murder of the Jews by the Germans and their collaborators. The mass killing process, as we know, began in the summer of 1941. Now, just to quickly place that in context, so in the summer of 1941, World War II had been underway for nearly 2 years. But the United States, of course, was not yet in the war. And in the summer of 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, that's when the organized mass killing began. Information about what was happening to the Jews under German occupation was slow to get out. Obviously, it was a different era. It was the pre-internet era. Moreover, not just pre-internet, but pre-television. So it wasn't like today when you have CNN on the scene, as it was in Darfur, as the genocide was unfolding before the eyes of the world, or today, even if it has not reached the level of genocide, the atrocities in Ukraine are being broadcast almost in real time. So we have to remember it was a different era. So when I say the news was slow to get out, what I mean is the mass killing began in the summer of 1941, but the first reports that there were these huge massacres only began reaching the West in the autumn of 1941. So it took a few months before anything was getting out. So we find, for example, in the New York Times, but not on the front pages, a few small articles in October, November of 1941, that there are reports of Jews being massacred by the tens of thousands in certain cities in occupied Russia, occupied Romania. But the news that was reaching the news media was even less than what was reaching Washington. So because the United States was not yet in the war, there were still American diplomats stationed in Europe. Aside from American diplomats, you had throughout the war, you had diplomats from neutral countries like Switzerland, who were still stationed in areas where they had access to this kind of information. So the diplomatic community, as it was in Europe, and reporters who were still in Europe, as there were, including American reporters, again, until America entered the war, were beginning to receive information principally from escapees. There were small numbers of Jews who had witnessed these mass massacres and who had escaped or eluded capture. The Roosevelt administration had much better intelligence and access to sources than the news media. So we find when looking at internal State Department memos, cables, correspondence in 1941 and early 1942, we find a steady stream of reports from American diplomats based in Switzerland about the mass killing. This is not mass killing in death camps. This was mass killing, what is today we call the Holocaust by bullets, in which hundreds and thousands of Jews were lined up in front of giant pits and machine gunned to death. So throughout the end of 1941 and especially into 1942, the Roosevelt administration was receiving increasingly detailed information about such killings. But it only began to reach wider sources, meaning the news media, some members of Congress, and Jewish groups in the summer of 1942 and into the early fall. As reports from escapees, refugees, Jewish groups in Europe began reaching the West, then again, there was pressure on the administration to say something or do anything. Interestingly, the pressure was largely coming from London. The British government was being pressed by British Jewish groups, by members of the British Parliament, and by Christian church leaders in England to say something about these mass killings. And so the British Foreign Office turned to the US State Department and proposed that they issue some kind of a declaration. Now I want to share with you the text of the brief statement, which the British and American officials composed, and which the other governments in exile and the Soviets all signed on to, and which was finally issued in December 1942. So this is well more than a year after the mass killing began, but still very early, as we know, in the Holocaust, because what we call the Holocaust would continue for another 2.5 years. This joint declaration, which was made public, as you see, on December 17, 1942, essentially confirmed, as they say, that the German authorities, and I'm reading from the middle, are now carrying into effect Hitler's oft-repeated intention to exterminate the Jewish people in Europe. And then it goes into some detail. From all the occupied territories, Jews are being transported in conditions of appalling horror and brutality to Eastern Europe. In Poland, which has been made the principal Nazi slaughterhouse, the ghettos established by the German invaders are being systematically emptied. People are being worked to death. The deportees are never heard from again. There are deliberate massacres and mass executions. I'm near the end of the first full paragraph. And the number of victims of these bloody cruelties is reckoned in many hundreds of thousands. That number was an underestimate even for that early period, but still, the Allies were acknowledging here that something unprecedented on a mass scale was taking place. And the statement concludes that the governments condemn in the strongest possible terms this bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination. They declare that such events can only strengthen the resolve of all freedom-loving people to overthrow Hitler. And the Allies reaffirm their resolution to ensure that those responsible will not escape retribution. And once again, and I'm comparing this to the earlier statement by Roosevelt, you see no practical response here. The statement does not promise to do anything. It doesn't say we will open our doors to refugees. It doesn't propose any kind of intervention to interrupt the mass murder process. Nothing to actually alleviate the persecution, the suffering of the Jews. Just simply a vague promise that after the war is over, there will be retribution, meaning war criminals will be punished, which is not exactly an innovation. Obviously, war criminals are punished when wars are over, but that didn't do much to help the people who were still slated for death. I want to share with you a very quick snapshot of how the American news media handled this statement. In doing so, I want to underline this. Until that Allied declaration in December 1942, the response of the Allies, of the Roosevelt administration and the Churchill administration in England, their response to pleas from Jewish groups and refugee advocates to do something to help the Jews, their response was, we don't really know what's happening yet. That's why the declaration was significant, because for the first time, the Allies were saying definitively in public, yes, we're confirming, we know it, it's happening, it's extermination, hundreds of thousands have already been killed, it's part of a policy. These are not random massacres, which occur pretty much in every war, tragically, but this is a policy by the German government to slaughter all of the Jews, to slaughter millions of Jews. So from that point on, from December 1942 on, the entire tenor of the Allied position regarding the Holocaust changed. It was no longer, we don't really know, the reports are unconfirmed, we're not sure. It was now, yes, it's a fact. So at this point, the increasing public debate about the Holocaust, about the Jewish refugee crisis, was, well, what are we going to do about it? And that's very important. But the first problem with what are we going to do about it, as we all know, is what does anybody know about it? Because when a crisis, persecution, is not known to the general public, there's very little chance the government officials will feel moved to do anything about it. They certainly won't feel any public pressure to do anything about it. So the first problem that rescue advocates, as I'm going to call them, Jewish organizations and others, rescue advocates faced was just getting the problem known so that it would be on the public agenda and there would be even a possibility of the Roosevelt administration doing something. So now for a quick look at how some of the major press covered that momentous Allied declaration confirming the mass murder. Let's begin with the New York Times, then as now one of the most important, influential, trend-setting newspapers in the world. So the New York Times did not consider the story of the mass extermination of the Jews worthy of even its own headline. They buried it as a little piece of a much longer story about other things happening, other things happening on the war front. And this is not a front page story either. This was on page, I believe, 14. The arrow points you to the two measly paragraphs that the Times allotted to the story. This is why the definitive book about how the New York Times covered the Holocaust, written by Professor Laurel Leff from Northeastern University in Boston, is called Buried by the Times, because the consistent pattern during these years was that the Times would bury news about the Holocaust at the end of other articles or in the back pages. More often than not, the problem was not that the Times ignored the Holocaust, but that it placed it in such a way that few people would become informed and fewer still would pay attention and want to do anything about it. One other major newspaper, just to make it clear that we're not talking about only the New York Times, but rather this was a broader problem. Here's the Chicago Tribune. The article on the right-hand column, as you see, is called "Charge Germans Make Poland a Jewish Abattoir, Slaughterhouse." So it's a more sizable article than the one that Times ran. It's actually an article on its own with a headline. But look where they placed it. It's back on the page with news about weddings. It's right next to news about a divorce. Again, buried in a part of the newspaper where it would just not be taken seriously as a major issue that people should do anything about. And this, unfortunately, is typical of American press coverage of the Holocaust. During the course of the year to follow, 1943, rescue advocates engaged in a number of increasingly high-profile protests to try to draw attention to the mass murder of the Jews and to put pressure on the Roosevelt administration to respond in some meaningful way. And the pressure included public rallies and a certain amount of lobbying in Washington, much of it organized not by the established Jewish organizations, but by a dissident group known as the Bergson Group, or the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, which used tactics that were rather novel in those days, such as sponsoring full-page newspaper ads, challenging the Roosevelt administration to do something to help the Jews. And when I say lobbying in Congress, the Bergson Group was one of the first, arguably the first, to recognize the importance of lobbying on both sides of the aisle. Many of the established Jewish leaders, like Rabbi Stephen Wise, head of the American Jewish Congress, generally only had relationships with Democrats because that was his party and he was comfortable with them on a range of issues. The Bergson Group, which did not consist of Republicans or conservatives, it consisted of rescue advocates from across the political spectrum. The Bergson Group recognized that in order to put pressure on the administration, they had to show that there was bipartisan support for rescue. And so their lobbying involved establishing relationships with Democrats and Republicans, both members of Congress and other high-profile figures like the only living ex-president at the time, who was a Republican, Herbert Hoover. The pressure on the Roosevelt administration did not immediately yield any results. As I noted earlier, the administration ultimately did not want to take any positive action. It did not want to open America's doors any wider to refugees, both because President Roosevelt himself was opposed to greater immigration, but also because of the political reality. He recognized that the public was not happy about the idea of greater immigration. But I pause to emphasize here that in looking at refugee immigration, we must always remember that the existing immigration quotas were almost never filled. So when we say that Roosevelt hesitated to allow in more refugees, it's not sufficient to note that while the public and Congress were against more admission of refugees, therefore Roosevelt's hands were tied. No, the existing quotas, which were already a matter of law, were almost never filled, meaning the White House and the State Department imposed a policy which suppressed immigration below the levels that the law allowed. During the period we're speaking of, from 1933 to 1945, there were nearly 200,000 unused immigration places from Germany and then from German-occupied countries. So there were a lot of Jews who could have been admitted within the existing laws. I state this because this is one of the underlying themes of FDR's response to the Holocaust, and one of the driving reasons why he did not want to draw attention to the Jews and did not want to take any concrete steps, because in the end, a lot of the discussion about what the Roosevelt administration could do came down to, well, should America open its doors to more refugees? Later, the issue of potentially bombing the railways and bridges leading to Auschwitz, to which Sarah Stern alluded earlier, that became an issue, and I'm going to address that briefly in our remaining time. But I want to show you one more document from 1943, because as the pressure from the Bergson Group and to a lesser extent from the established Jewish groups increased, the Roosevelt administration felt the need to say something. And so they used the occasion of a tripartite conference in Moscow in 1943, the end of 1943, at which the Soviet, British, and American foreign ministers met to discuss war strategy and problems related to the war. And at the end of this important conference of Allied leaders, a statement was issued, which included, in one part of it, what they call the Declaration of German Atrocities. I won't read this entire statement. Anyone who's interested, by the way, in the text of any of the documents that I've been sharing can contact Emmet afterwards, and I'll be glad to send these to you. But the key point I want to draw your attention to in this document is that it's specifically a declaration about German atrocities against civilians in 1943, which is the peak of the Holocaust, at a time when the Allies had already verified that they knew what the Germans were doing to the Jews. And yet what we see in the third paragraph is that the only victims of the Germans who were mentioned in this declaration on German atrocities, as you see, are, I'm looking at the third paragraph, wholesale shootings of Italian officers, execution of French, Dutch, Belgian, Norwegian hostages or Cretan peasants, or the slaughters inflicted on the people of Poland or in territories of the Soviet Union. That's as close as you get to referring to the Jews, but there's no Jews there. I mean, there were also non-Jews in Poland and Soviet territories who were victims of German atrocities. So this statement deliberately avoided the obvious main victim of the German atrocities. And again, for the same reason as I've been describing, a desire to avoid calling too much attention to the plight of the Jews in order to avoid increased pressure to do something about that plight. And now in our remaining time, I want to shift to this important question of the failure to what today we call it in shorthand, the failure to bomb Auschwitz. And what the news media was reporting at the time that was relevant to it, and what was going on behind the scenes in the White House. Again, just briefly, first let's consider the question of what was known to the news media and therefore to the American public. In the spring of 1944, and this is the only period, prior to this period, the issue of possibly bombing rail lines leading to the death camps was not yet a viable option because the Allies did not yet have control over the skies of Europe. But by the spring of 1944, they did. So once Allied planes were regularly bombing targets throughout Europe, then that brought into play the possibility of also bombing targets to interrupt the mass murder of the Jews. And now we're focusing chiefly on the question of the Jews in Hungary, because it was in March 1944 that the last major Jewish community in Europe, which had not yet been occupied by the Germans, that is, Hungarian Jews, finally came under the heels of the German conquest. So in March 1944, the Germans occupied Hungary, and that last major Jewish community, 800,000 Jews, now were targets. And at this point, in the spring of 1944, the major death camps were all operating at full capacity. And this was the point at which Auschwitz reached its maximum death toll. 12,000 Jews were being gassed to death every single day in Auschwitz. What's remarkable about the news media coverage of the Hungarian deportations is how much was known. I've spoken earlier about how the New York Times and other newspapers buried news about the Holocaust. And they still didn't even put the Hungarian deportations on the front pages. But as you'll see from the clipping I'm about to show you, in fact, what was happening, what was about to happen, and then what was happening to the Jews of Hungary was actually quite well known and well publicized at the time, even in newspapers such as the New York Times. Here now we're looking at a story on page 5. Obviously, it should have been on page 1 by any measure of journalistic responsibility, but nonetheless, it's page 5. It's a sizable article. It has its own headline. The headline is "Jews in Hungary Fear Annihilation." In this article, the correspondent says quite explicitly in the opening paragraph, the Germans are now preparing for the annihilation of Hungarian Jews. And he goes on to describe in the third paragraph how thousands of Jews, including women with babies in arms, already have been murdered in gas chamber baths in these German camps in Poland. He says 5.5 million Jews in Europe already have been put to death in one form or another by the Germans. So there's a level of detail in this report and others which followed, which I think is startling in retrospect, but what it also tells you, what it also reveals to us is that what was about to happen and what was already happening, the Times is reporting this, by the way, just a few days before the mass deportations began. So it's almost in real time. That this was known not just to the Roosevelt administration through its private intelligence, but also it was known to the wider public. And this is the kind of report which led to repeated requests by Jewish organizations and other rescue advocates to bomb railway lines or bridges leading to Auschwitz specifically, or in addition, the possibility of bombing the crematoria themselves. Most of the bombing requests focused on the railway lines and the bridges for a specific reason. It was well known that bombing railway lines was a part of the overall Allied strategy. The Germans were bombing, the Allies were bombing German railway lines throughout Europe all the time because it was on those railway lines that that troops and weapons were being transported. So it was a part of the military strategy to do that. Although the Germans often were able to repair railway lines pretty quickly, still, the Allies hit them again and again because even brief interruptions helped the war effort. And needless to say, even a brief interruption of the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz would have interrupted the mass murder process. Bombing bridges would have caused even more significant delays because bridges could not be easily or quickly repaired. And that's why the Allies were hitting them again and again. But they did not hit the railway lines or the bridges on the route to Auschwitz that Jewish leaders specifically requested again and again. And in many of the requests, the actual railway routes and the bridges were named because these were requests that Jewish groups in America were receiving from their sources in Europe, saying, if you hit this junction, if you hit this bridge, it will stop the flow of deportees. The failure, the refusal of the Roosevelt administration to strike those targets was not because the president or the administration wanted the Jews to be killed. Certainly not. But the administration was also not willing to expend even the most minimal resources, even to hit targets that were already in the same region, even the most minimal resources to help the Jews. And then to have what would be the corollary of that would be to have large numbers of Jewish refugees on their hands, on the Allies' hands. What would they do with them? They didn't want them to bring them to America. The British didn't want to let them into Palestine. This was a problem the Allied leadership did not want to face. And so I want to conclude by showing you one fascinating behind-the-scenes document. Because of all the calls, not just for bombing the railways, but in general, calls on the administration, on Washington to do something. In April 1944, President Roosevelt and his advisors commissioned a private Gallup poll to find out whether the public was still as opposed to immigration as it had been earlier. I'm going to show you the actual report that Gallup provided to the White House, revealing the results. The question was whether or not the United States should give temporary refuge. I underline temporary refuge, not permanent immigrants, but just allow refugees to come in large numbers until the end of the war. What the poll found was that 70% of Americans were willing to accept large numbers of Jewish refugees temporarily to save their lives until the war was over. Only 23% disapproved. This is a remarkable number because it's essentially a reversal of earlier public attitudes towards letting in more Jewish refugees. So to the extent that the administration, that the president was afraid of public opinion and public opposition to immigration, to the extent that that was a factor in his earlier refusal to admit more Jewish refugees, now what he discovered was that there was overwhelming public support, and that therefore, if he chose to do something to admit more refugees, there would be no controversy. On the contrary, there would be public support. The president suppressed this poll. This poll was never released to the public. It was never reported by the news media. President Roosevelt ultimately agreed to admit only one token batch of about 900 Jewish refugees. They were admitted in the summer of 1944. They were housed in an abandoned army camp in upstate New York, Oswego, New York. And that was the total of how far the president was willing to go, despite everything that was known about the mass murder of the Jews. With that, and recognizing our time constraints, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share these documents and my thoughts with you, and happy to take any questions. And if there are additional questions after our webinar concludes, again, please send them to Emmett, and they'll be forwarded to me, and I'm glad to answer any questions, or again, to share any of the documents that I've been showing you today.
Okay, I have a lot of questions. Just very briefly, I mean, since that poll came out in the end of the war in 1945, they could have saved how many Jews? if they had
1944, actually.
Yeah,
So
but at the end of the
right.
war.
Well, but the poll, so the poll was April 1944. The war
right.
went on for about another year. When that poll came out, that poll came out before the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews began. So to answer your question, well, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported in May and June, July of 1944, deported to Auschwitz and gassed.
Right.
So that's how many lives were at stake, over 400,000. And that's only the Jews from Hungary. Now, I should just add, the other death camps were also, most of them were still in operation in 1944. And there were Jews being still deported from other parts of Europe. So we're talking about a very substantial number of Jewish prisoners, of Jewish inmates, Jewish deportees, in theory, could have been rescued, could have been saved, had the administration taken some practical step other than the extremely minimal token action that it took.
So what was the real motivation if it wasn't public unwillingness to accept refugees?
Well, we begin with FDR's unwillingness. As we know, presidential decisions are always a combination of a president's personal inclinations, the political pressures that are around him, and then also political calculations such as what will affect his reelection. And this was true with FDR as well. But to begin with his personal inclinations, he was always, and we know from the documents, he was always personally strongly opposed to more immigration in general. His vision, Franklin Roosevelt's vision of how America should look, was that it should be overwhelmingly white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. So admitting a large number of Jews was something which was anathema to him in general. And by the way, a similar sentiment helps explain his policy vis-a-vis Japanese Americans, why he ordered the internment of 130,000 innocent Japanese Americans, because his attitude towards Asians was similar to his attitude toward Jews. He did not want to have too many of them in America. And we know this from a lot of his private statements as well. FDR unfortunately shared a lot of the what we would call anti-Semitic prejudices of his era, of any era really. We know from his private statements, he saw Jews as potentially domineering, as unwilling to become full Americans, as being essentially untrustworthy. And so admitting any significant number of Jewish refugees, even allowing the existing quotas to be filled, clashed ultimately with with FDR's vision of what America should look like. Now you add to that his perception of the public being opposed to helping the Jews. And that perception was not inaccurate, except that it didn't carry through this entire period. And as he knew from this April 1944 poll, in fact, public opinion changed. It changed significantly.
Right. My last question, and then we'll just have a few minutes to open up the floor to questions, is, as you know, Rafi, Ahmed has been on Capitol Hill meeting with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle for months and months and months about the dangers of the JCPOA, and stories have not really been getting out that should be getting out. For example, last Sunday, Ali Motahari, a moderate member of the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, said, "When we began our nuclear activity, our goal was always to build a bomb. There's no need to beat around the bush." So many stories of 900 Gold Star families who've lost loved ones to the IRGC, who wrote a letter to the president asking that the IRGC's foreign terrorist organization label not be lifted. These stories get no play in the press. Do you see any parallels at all?
So here we have a remarkable situation in which the question is not how America should respond to genocide or to atrocities, but here you have a potential genocide, a threatened genocide. You have an Iranian regime that openly threatens to exterminate, as they put it, millions of Jews, of Israeli Jews, which also has sponsored massacres of Jews in other countries. as in Argentina, for example. And so here we have an opportunity to preempt genocide, and yet tragically we see certain aspects of what's unfolding today comparable to some of the more disturbing aspects of the events we've talked about in the 1930s and 1940s, for example, as you're noting, the reluctance or failure of much of the news media to give adequate attention to important aspects of the danger that the Iranians are posing, or of the more disturbing aspects of current Iranian policy, both nuclear development and sponsoring international terrorism. So although we like to think that we've learned the lessons from the 30s and 40s, and in some ways we have, you can point to areas in which we could say there's been progress. America takes a greater interest. American Jews are more active and protest more loudly than they did then. And yet, sadly, we can also see areas such as some of the news media coverage in which it feels like the lessons of that terrible era have not yet been fully learned.
And on that cheery note, I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Gabe Toole, who will be fielding the questions that have come in.
All right, thank you so much. We are not going to be able to get to everyone's questions, so we're really sorry, but I'm going to do my best to ask as many as I can. To start, I'm kind of actually packaging 3 questions into one, but they are all related. It goes back more to the beginning. So why did the media never ask FDR hardball questions? And specifically, there were multiple news sources. There was some competition, I would imagine, between news sources. In today's age, you have this competition where people are trying to get the best, most current news, put that on the front page first. So why was FDR not ever getting any hardball questions? Why you mentioned multiple times that newspapers would report it, but it would be way further down. Now, was that intentional to try and suppress the story, or were the news sources just not thinking that this was worthy news, and that is why it was not on the front page? And then the last kind of related question is, you spoke a lot about kind of how the media was behaving then. Do you see any similarities or differences then and now? How has the media changed, and how has reporting changed from the time of FDR to now?
The American news media in the 30s certainly were more compliant and more deferential to the president than we are accustomed in our time. Let's remember that the idea of a combative oppositional news media is more a product of the 1960s and later. The Vietnam era really saw the beginning of major news media actively confronting and challenging presidents. We think about things like the leaking of the Pentagon Papers, or the Watergate crisis, and the roles that the news media played in challenging and arguably toppling the president. But it was not that way in the 1930s. Very few American journalists felt that they were that it was appropriate to challenge a president. This was even more of a problem during the Roosevelt years, because FDR was extremely popular among both the public and among the press. So they supported his policies. They did not want, I'm speaking broadly, but most journalists did not want to embarrass the president by asking him questions that he did not want to address, or that he would not be able to address in a way that would reflect well on him. So you had a problem of a press that was kind of playing along. Now, that's the first part of your question. The last part of your question was the parallels. Well, I think this is one of the areas we can point to where there has been considerable improvement, even with all its flaws. First of all, today you have a much more, you have a lot of variety in the media. You have a politically liberal, politically conservative media. So no matter who the president is, there's at least a somewhat substantial body of journalists who begin with an oppositional attitude. And that's healthy, because then they will ask questions that the more sympathetic journalists won't ask. But as we see with regard to Iran and other issues, there still is often a problem of major controversial issues not being given the attention they deserve because some segments of the news media do not want to embarrass the sitting president. So that problem still exists. And I think I've addressed the first and third parts of your question. What was the second part again?
The second part was, why bury the stories? Why not front page?
So this is a question that has been addressed in some detail by two scholars in particular. I mentioned the book Buried by the Times by Laura Leff. Before that, Deborah Lipstad's book Beyond Belief. And they both came to the same conclusion, or same conclusions. And there were a variety of reasons why the news tended to be buried in the back pages. So one reason was a simple, as Professor Lipstad's title indicates, a difficulty simply believing the news, simply accepting that a civilized country like Germany could be perpetrating such incredible, uncivilized actions, mass killings. So there was some of that shock. Secondly, there probably was some element of anti-Semitism, which is to say, among some segment of the news media in those days, there was an attitude of, this is just the Jews' problem. The rest of us don't really have to worry about it. Or more often, the Jews are probably exaggerating what they're saying about their atrocities. It's probably not so bad. Now, unfortunately, the Roosevelt administration helped encourage and feed that attitude of exaggerated skepticism, because Roosevelt administration officials would also say, we don't really know what's going on. The Jews could be exaggerating this in order to gin up sympathy for themselves. So a disbelief, anti-Semitism, these were factors. Now, there were also factors that were inherent to the circumstances of the time. In other words, once World War II got underway, then there was a severe competition for news space. Naturally, the war effort dominated the front pages. But that still doesn't adequately explain putting news about the slaughter of millions of people, next to divorce announcements. And here, in the case of the New York Times, Professor Leff does a particularly important job of analyzing and understanding the motives of specific editors and publishers. So in the unfortunate case of the New York Times, its publishers, and especially, were Jewish, but they were deeply assimilated Jews who were extremely reluctant to call attention to Jewish issues because they were afraid that the New York Times would be accused of helping the Jews, of being partial to Jewish concerns. So in the particular case of the New York Times, which sadly then was the trendsetter for much of the rest of the news media, news about the suffering of the Jews was being deliberately ignored or downplayed or buried in the back pages because the Jewish publishers of the Times didn't want people to think badly of them.
Thank you, Dr. Medoff. We've only got like a couple more minutes. I'll try and squeeze in one more question. I'm going to combine a couple as well. So we've had a couple related to basically what role did religious groups play in trying to gather support for the Jews, both Christians and Jewish organizations. So you mentioned a couple times there were these Christian groups that were trying to get some support. And on the Jewish side, specifically like the American Jewry, how were they working to garner support?
To begin with, the response of American Christians to news of the Holocaust. Their response overall was quite weak. I mentioned that there were some Christian voices, and there were some exceptions. There were a minority of church officials from all denominations who made statements or tried to help in Jewish refugee advocacy. But by and large, the response of both the Catholic Church in the United States and the various Protestant denominations was one of indifference. Now, we can't go into much more detail about that because of our time constraints now, and more research has to be done. But in general, the American Christian response was very disappointing. The American Jewish response was more complicated. I've alluded to the fact that the dissident activist group, the Bergsonites, were active in organizing protests and newspaper ads. The established Jewish leaders were much slower to respond, much less vocal, and often very divided in their responses. And so they weren't always as effective as they could have been. In part, this was because Rabbi Wise's relationship with President Roosevelt in some ways compromised Wise's effectiveness. And I single out Wise because he was the head of the American Jewish Congress, the World Jewish Congress, the American Zionist movement, and other institutions. So he was an extremely powerful and influential Jewish leader, certainly the most important Jewish leader of that era. And yet he had a relationship with President Roosevelt, which was essentially a one-sided love affair. He deeply supported FDR's domestic agenda and his policies in general, and Wise was extremely reluctant to ever challenge the president in public on anything. And that made him a much less effective Jewish leader when it came to addressing the problem of the Jews being persecuted in Europe. So the Bergson group and other dissidents in the Jewish community often had to step in and fill that vacuum and speak out in ways that Rabbi Wise and other Jewish leaders often were reluctant to do.
Thank you very much. We are all out of time now. Dr. Medoff, this has been a phenomenal speech as always. Sarah, I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Right. One of our viewers actually wrote in, what could be done about the JCPOA? To us at AMET, the parallels are very vivid between what happened in the United States, the lack of response by the organized Jewish community, or a lack of a coordinated response among all the organizations, an effective response. And certainly by the media suppressing certain stories, by the State Department actually being spin doctors for the Iranian regime and not letting certain facts, which we should all know about, be part of the negotiations, if not negotiations, should at least convince them not to negotiate. The fact that there are 40 to 42 kilograms of highly enriched uranium at the 60% level, which the Institute for Science and International Security says is actually enough for a nuclear bomb. It doesn't have to go to the 90% level. All of this is very, very important. And I think one of our viewers said, what can be done about the JCPOA? And we are here to tell you, you must call your member of Congress on either side of the aisle and say that we need a free and open congressional debate of the details of this deal before it's signed and before it's a fait accompli and before at least $90 billion of Iranian assets are unfrozen and given to the regime, which will only enforce the regime and make sure that it endures for generations to come. This is very, very important. This is not only a threat to Israel and the Gulf countries, this is also a threat to the United States because they have Hezbollah terror groups, not only within our country, but very strong presence in the tri-border area of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, and very close ties between Chile and Iran and the Maduro regime of Venezuela and Iran. So I urge you all to just call your member of Congress to get the facts and make sure that none of this money gets transferred behind closed doors to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that we need a free and open public debate. That is why they are there. They have a responsibility, according to Article 1 of the Constitution, for advice and consent, and according to Article 2 for oversight. And that's why we have elected officials. So I can't thank you enough, Rafi, for your brilliance and all of your research. And really delighted that we got such a large audience today. Please, if anybody can, all of this costs Amit a great deal of expense, energy, and effort to be able to educate the public with wonderful scholars such as Dr. Rafael Medoff. So if you can support us at www.metonline.org, we would really appreciate that. And also if you can support the David Wyman Institute, where Rafi is the founder and director, I would really appreciate that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.